Hi, I'm Andy Clark, and I'm here to talk about the extended mind story. I guess back in 1998, working with David Chalmers, I was one of the original architects of the extended mind story. And what I'm going to do today is just present a kind of a bare bones version of that story and try and say something about why I think the story might matter for people working in the humanities and in other sciences to do with the mind. So I think it's worth starting by trying to express the claim as carefully as we can. The extended mind claim is that non-biological resources, stuff that isn't made of neurons basically, or flesh, that stuff like that, as long as it's appropriately hooked up with the stuff that is made of neurons and flesh, gets to form larger circuits that can count as cognitive circuits in their own right. So the idea is that the actual machinery of your mind can in these cases turn out to be spread across brain, body and world. So it's worth asking what the relation of this is to work in distributed cognition, the kind of overarching theme of this series. I think the idea here is that, well, this is a kind of extreme form of distributed cognition. In some of the less extreme forms, cognition is distributed just in the sense that several people might be working together to solve a problem, or maybe people and artifacts are coordinating their behaviours to guide a ship into harbour. But in these cases, the claim really is quite extreme. The claim is that what's going on in the biological brain plus what's going on in these other circuits is the cognitive system. It is the underlying structure of your individual mind. So this is about a spreading of the individual mind into the world, if you like. So one thing that we should say here, I think, is what the target isn't. The target isn't, if you like, the mere possibility claim, the claim that the machinery of mind, maybe in some alien species that isn't us humans, might turn out to be spread across, for example, their alien brains, bodies, and bits of their alien worlds. It's not that claim at all. The claim is that this is the normal case, that this is how human beings are, that this is how you and I are. So it's worth also thinking here that the claim isn't something kind of fairly vanilla, like that stuff going on outside of the brain affects what we think. It's not the claim that non-brain activity, if you like, impacts the mind. Nobody can deny that there's causal commerce between mind and world, and that matters. In the simplest case, where I look determines what I see. So if I move my head around, I see different things, and I think different thoughts. That's not a case of the extended mind in action. So the contentious claim, one more time, is that the mechanisms of mind, the machinery of mind, are not all in the head. So I think there's a useful analogy here. It's as if someone said to you, hey look, the machinery of your calculator isn't actually all on the desktop, on the laptop machine in front of you. This is very often true, for example, if we use a web-based currency converter or even a web-based calculator. But it's not always true if, for example, you've got a calculator built right into your iPhone or into the machinery in front of you. So the claim here, is a perfect analogy, I think, to the extended mind claim, will be that in a sense it doesn't really matter where the whirring and grinding of the machinery is, as long as it provides access to the right information at the right time. And that's a claim we'll come back to later on. So the main idea is that the mechanisms of your mind are as free to bleed into the rest of the world, into what's going on in the rest of your body, into what's going on in the artifacts that surround you, as the mechanisms of calculation are to bleed into the web. So the question really, if you're a philosopher here, is just how mad is this claim? Is this just totally, totally crazy? And the main job of the extended mind arguments is to try to convince you, using a bunch of fairly simple thought experiments, that in fact it's not crazy and that this is how we are. So I'll start by running through these kind of philosophical thought experiments, and after that I'll move into looking at some rather more technological ways of approaching the same issues. So let's start by looking at some of the philosophical arguments supposed to support the idea that minds like ours can actually be extended into the world. The first thought experiment back in the 1998 paper involved what you can think of as a kind of cyborg version of the Tetris game. So most of you will have played Tetris at some point. In standard Tetris, to see if a Zoid is a possible, Zoid, one of these coloured shapes that you see on the screen here, is a possible fit into a place below it, you've got several options. One option is you can just kind of rotate it in your imagination and try and see if it would fit. Another option is that you can use the fast rotate button on the machine, which will rotate the Zoid in front of you, and you can then inspect the resulting orientation to see if it will fit. If it will, you can drop it in. If it won't, you can rotate it back. So when we do this in our imagination, we say this is a mental event. And if we do it using the external fast rotate button, we say, hey, that's a physical event. But now let's imagine in some kind of cyberpunk future that both of these options are supported, and they're both supported internally. So you now have what you can think of as a fast rotate implant that you can activate by a mental command, and the outputs of that fast rotate implant operation are entered into your conscious experience, just like those of the external rotate button. And you can imagine intermediate cases. You could imagine an intermediate case using Google Glasses, for example, or something like that. So let's assume, just for the sake of argument, that the computational operations being used by the rotation implant are the same ones as were previously used in the external rotate button. And at this point, as with many philosophical thought experiments, we just ask you to sort of inspect your intuitions. So in the standard setup, the fast rotate circuitry is located outside the head, and the results are read in by perception. In the cyberpunk case, the fast rotate circuitry is implanted within skin and skull, and the results are read off by introspection. They're just fed into your conscious experience. So we tend to think of the normal case as just ordinary tool use, the use of external supporting equipment. And we think of the cyberpunk case as maybe, just maybe, a new kind of genuinely mental operation supported by this neural implant. And I think the main kind of point that the extended mind argument tries to make is that actually we shouldn't be so impressed by the boundary between internal and external in that way. That's to say that maybe we should treat the external case on a par with the internal case because of their deeper kind of similarities. So the thought is that there's a prima facie case here for parity of treatment between the standard case and the cyberpunk case. Parity of treatment which is based on what we stipulated to be a deep computational commonality between the operations that were involved, rather than just our kind of skin and skull prejudices. Our prejudices that if it's not already bounded by the package of the ancient skin bag, then it can't be part of our mind. So the best known argument, I think, for the extended mind, the second philosophical argument here, is an argument involving the case of Otto and Inge. This is from the 1998 paper as well. And we'll set it up this way, that it's maybe just worth saying that the names here, Otto and Inge, were chosen so that Otto is kind of for out, stuff going on outside, Inge is kind of for in, stuff going on inside. So Inge hears about an exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art. She thinks to herself, where's the Museum of Modern Art? Yeah, it's on 53rd Street. So she walks to 53rd Street and goes in. So that's a standard case. Now think about Otto. Otto has mild Alzheimer's. Otto carries a notebook, and whenever he learns new pieces of information, particularly about addresses, he writes it in. When Otto hears of the exhibition at MoMA, he finds the address in his trusty notebook and he goes along. So in the 1998 paper, David Chalmers and I tried to argue that Otto, when he walks to 53rd Street, does so because he wants to go to the museum, same as Inge, but also, just like Inge, Otto believed, even before he looked in his notebook, that it was on 53rd Street. So this is clearly where the kind of philosophical issues bite. Question that we started with, just how mad is this? Can we really say that he believed that before consulting his notebook? We do say that of Inge, for example. We say she believed it before consulting her memory. She had a long-term stand-in belief. So our question really is, why don't we say the same about Otto? And in fact, our claim will be that we ought to say the same about Otto. So let's run through a few typical responses. First thing that people will always say here is, look, all that Otto really believes, in advance if you like, is that the information is in the notebook. So they think Otto is very, very different to Inge. All Otto believes in advance is that the answer is somewhere in the notebook. But now think, we don't say to ourselves that Inge's only previous belief was that the information was stored in her memory. Why don't we say that about Inge? Why don't we say, well, she didn't antecedently believe that the museum was on 53rd Street. She just believed that her memory, her biological memory, held the right information. But we don't say that, do we? I think one reason that we don't say that is it seems to add spurious complexity to our explanations. We'd end up having to say, Inge wanted to go to the Museum of Modern Art. She believed that her memory held the address. Her memory then yielded 53rd Street. That seems clumsy. Her behaviour is fluent. There's no need for us to insert these intervening steps. But ditto, Dave Chalmers and I argued for Otto. Otto always consults a book if biological memory fails him. He consults it fluently, and his activities are, if you like, guided by the information that's in the book just as fluently as Inge's activities are. So let's move on to a second kind of possible objection here. Some people have said, look, Inge may have no beliefs at all about her memory. She just uses her memory transparently, if you like. Whereas Otto, maybe Otto needs to believe that the information's in his notebook. Maybe his notebook has to be kind of within cognitive sight in some way. So we want to tweak the story at that point and say, hey, look, Otto's been practicing with this notebook for a very long time. He's so used to using the notebook that he just uses it automatically whenever biological memory within some very short period of time fails to deliver the right answer. So it's become what philosophers have called transparent equipment, equipment that you just use to solve your problems without the equipment being part of your focus. For example, when you're writing an essay using a pencil, the pencil isn't part of your cognitive focus, it's the writing, it's what you're trying to express that is. So let's move on to another possible worry. Another worry is that Otto, in reaching for the notebook, acts intentionally. Philosophers have said, hey, look, maybe no such intentions intervene during Inge's more instinctive memory recall. This is very much the same as the previous issue that we were looking at. So again, we want to say, look, Otto might just reach for the book as a reflex, just like Inge reaches, if you like, as a reflex for her own biological long-term memory, LTM on the slide. Or you can attack the problem from the other side. Suppose that Inge took a soporific drug of some kind, and this meant that it was a great effort now for her to recall certain facts. So she'd actually have to try, she'd have to intend to recall them, work at recalling them. We wouldn't end up saying that just because she has to do that, that she didn't, as it were, know them in advance. It's just a little bit harder for her to get at the information. So there's a kind of double move here. You either make the non-biologically supported case a little bit more like the biological one, or you fiddle with the biological one to make it a little bit more like the non-biological one. And I think it's fair to say that every known objection to the extended mind argument pretty well falls to this sort of pincer movement. There's one argument that I think maybe doesn't. So this is the last one of the philosophical arguments that I'll talk about. And it's a worry about bloat and ooze, if you like. The thought is, hey, look, the main worry about this is that my mind is just going to get too big. My mind threatens to expand, to include all the stuff that I can access through all kinds of props and supports. Surely the thought is this can't be a good picture of our mind, either for science or for philosophy. So to put it kind of brutally, if I keep the Encyclopaedia Britannica in my garage, does that turn all of its contents into my own dispositional beliefs? If I chat to you on the bus, does your mind become temporarily part of my extended cognitive system? So this is the worry about bloat and ooze. And if you put bloat into the Google image search, this is what you get. So Clark and Chalmers argued that we can tame the bloat with just a few more refinements to the original thought experiment. And we suggested that these refinements weren't ad hoc, that these are, if you like, just a reflection of typical features of dispositional believing, stand-in beliefs. That's to say, for example, your stand-in belief that the Battle of Hastings was in 1066, the kind of stuff that you count as believing even when you're not currently rehearsing it. So in order to tame the bloat, we suggested that the augmentation has to be reliably available and typically invoked when needed. So Otto, for example, always carries a notebook, and he won't say he doesn't know where the museum is, for example, until he's reflexively, automatically consulted it. And the information that's retrieved has to be automatically endorsed. That's to say, you have to pretty well believe, Otto has to pretty well just believe what the notebook delivers. It's not 100%, because you don't always have to believe what your own biological memory delivers. Every now and again, you might think, hey, I might be wrong about that. But in general, you trust what your own biological memory says, and in general, Otto has to trust what the notebook comes up with. And that's maybe a bit different from the case of the companion on the bus, depending perhaps on the companion. And lastly, maybe most importantly, the information in the notebook is easily accessed as and when required. That needs a really good index, for example. It works easily for the Otto case because we're only really thinking about some simple bits of information. But for more complicated sort of structures of information, you would need a much more complicated system of access. And finally, maybe just notice that everything that gets into Otto's notebook was consciously endorsed by Otto in the past. We're not sure, really, whether this is a requirement or not. We think it probably isn't, because stuff could get into your biological memory without you endorsing it. Maybe you're kind of subliminally primed for something. But it's worth thinking about that as a possible extra requirement. So we think of these as the conditions of glue and trust. Glue because the resource has to be available when you need it. Trust because, in general, you have to trust what it comes up with. And I think when you have these glue and trust conditions, you get, if you like, extended biotechnological systems that have the right kind of flavour. You'll kind of rule out a book in my library. It's just not accessible enough as and when I need that information. The web, well, not always. Sometimes it fails the trust requirement, sometimes access is variable, but if we sorted out trust stuff for the web and access was more robust, it would pass the test. Neural implants, assuming that the information is trusted and robust, yeah, they'll pass the test. Other people, they usually fail the test. They fail glue, they're not always there when you need them, and they fail trust, you don't always trust them. But you can imagine cases where they pass glue and trust. Maybe some long-term couples have that kind of cognitive structure between them, and so on. So one last worry is that Otto could misread the notebook, whereas Inge, if you might think at least, that Inge can't misread her memory. So there's a kind of opening for error when Otto accesses a notebook that you might think makes it seem that the notebook is more like a part of the external world than an aspect of the agent. So again, I think you can probably see by now the general structure of our responses to this whole swathe of arguments. So you could say, look, Inge might misremember an event, not because of some error in her storage, but because of something that goes wrong at the moment of retrieval. So that would be, if you like, functionally equivalent to misreading information that is appropriately stored. So another thing that we can try and do here is just totally circumvent the whole process of sensory reading. So imagine now a no hands, no eyes version of Otto. This is the kind of cyberpunk version of Otto, if you like. Otto is now neurally linked to an external database. With practice, Otto learns how to access the information in that database at will, recovering what he needs when, maybe by a quick subvocal prompt of some kind. With enough practice, he'll start to automatically issue that kind of prompt. He won't have to think, hey, it's time for me to prompt the rest of my machinery to do the right thing. Over time, he may just come to feel that the answers to those sorts of questions just come to him when he needs that sort of information. It's all a bit sci-fi, I agree. But one of the things I think Chalmers and I are trying to do here is to focus our attention on a kind of issue about how important that process of sensory reading might be. Because there's a certain sense in which what's going on functionally, if you like, when we read information in via the ordinary sensory route is just the same as what's going on functionally when information is kind of brought in by a kind of more direct route that doesn't go right through some process of external sensing. And part of the claim that Chalmers and I have tried to defend, I think, is that, in fact, the distinction here may not be as deep as it at first appears. That functionally speaking, what really matters is the flow of information and what information is retrieved when. And that as long as that flow of information has the right kind of shape, then stuff that from one perspective looks like sensory reading, from another perspective just looks like internal information flow. So there's a thing to think about there. So there's another philosophical worry here, and this is perhaps it's a deeper worry. It's a worry associated very much with the work of Fred Adams and Ken Aizawa. Their worry is that the symbols in Otto's notebook mean what they mean only courtesy of a kind of convention. we humans have sort of agreed, or we English-speaking humans have agreed what those particular symbols are going to mean. By contrast, Adams and Aizawa say, the cognitive goings-on inside the head of Otto, they don't depend for their contents on any kinds of conventions. They have what's sometimes called non-derived content. So there's a quote here from Adams Aizawa: whatever is responsible for non-derived representations seems to find a place only in brains. So I think there's a move that we can make in response here, and that's to think of the case where, when you're trying to solve a problem, you might first conjure a certain kind of mental image, and then inspect that mental image to read off the result. And I'm thinking in particular of cases where there's a certain amount of convention involved in, if you like, the assignment of meanings to those aspects of the mental imagery. So think about imagining the overlapping circles of a Venn diagram when you're solving some kind of set theoretic puzzle. Or even imagining doing long division using pen and paper, but you don't have pen and paper, so you imagine in your head doing those operations, and then you read the answer off from your own imagination. I think in cases like that, we do have a process which, although it's a fully internal process, involves a manipulation of items, these kinds of mental images in this case, that have at least some of their contents derivatively. They depend on conventional practices of, what it means for the middle part of two overlapping Venn diagram circles to coincide in a certain kind of way. Another worry here, moving closer to the kind of scientific worries, this will be a kind of bridge towards those, is that what they call transcranial, the extended processes that we've been trying to highlight, if you like, that processes like that are not likely, they say, to give rise to interesting scientific regularities. They suspect that there are no laws governing humans and their tool use, over and above the laws of inner human cognition and the laws of whatever applies to the external tools. I think it's very hard to judge this worry. It's not, I don't think it's been really very, very clearly formulated yet. But a first response might be to say, look, we do already have a science of human-computer interaction, and more recently a science of cognitive technologies, and neither of those sciences looks like just a kind of conjunction of truths about what goes on inside and truths about the external tools. It looks like there are interesting regularities in, if you like, the checks and balances that emerge when biological systems get together with certain kinds of technological prop and support. So I think the kind of thought here is that we won't know if there's a science here until we give it a try. So I think there's also another route into the extended mind conclusions, and it's one that I've explored, for example, in the book Natural Born Cyborgs. This is a route from, if you like, increase in biotechnological hybridization. And the basic thought here is that brains like ours are extremely good at trading access against onboard storage. And there are lots of ways of demonstrating this. A very simple one, actually, is just to think about your experience of the visual scene. We experience the visual scene in front of us as coloured all the way to the edges, if you like. But if you were to stand in front of me and I were to get you to fixate my nose, and I were to hold out two playing cards, hold out two playing cards, and ask you what colour those playing cards are, whether one, which one's red, which one's black, whether they're both red, you wouldn't be able to answer that question until I brought the playing cards into much closer to the centre of your field of view. Remember, you would be fixating my nose all this time. So that's quite surprising to most people. And yet at the same time, if you look at the kind of structure of the retina, it seems that information pickup at the peripheries is much, much poorer than information pickup at the centre. So that's also surprising in a way. It makes you wonder, why does the scene seem to you detailed all the way out? Why does it seem to be coloured all the way out? Given that, in fact, moment by moment, you can only pick up detail and colour really in a fairly central area. So the suggestion, thought that's out there in the literature, is that the feeling of seeing colour all the way to the edges and the feeling of seeing detail in the scene all the way out, if you like, that this is actually due to a kind of meta-knowledge that you, or rather your brain, knows that it can access colour information and detail information as and when it needs it. And because that information is poised for easy access in that way, it feels to us, the agent, as if we already command the information. So for work on this kind of suggestion, look at the work of Alva Noe, for example, and people working on sensory-motor contingency theory. The moral of this kind of story is that reliable access is as good as onboard storage. And this is just what the earlier opening example of the web-based calculator or the web-based currency converter should be making you think. But I think once we see that reliable access is as good as onboard storage, then the extended mind conclusions are really not very far away. Roboticists and psychologists, I think, have known this for a while. Rodney Brooks, at the forefront of the mobile robots revolutions back in the 90s, had the slogan, "The world is its own best model." Kevin O'Regan in psychology had the slogan, "The world as external memory." So I think this is true, of course, not just of seeing, it's true of knowing as well. So compare, for example, your sense that you already know what month this is. You don't have that sense just because you kind of go around mentally rehearsing September, September, September all the time. Instead, what happens is, well, you know this is the kind of thing you know. You have a kind of meta-knowing, if you like. You know this is the kind of thing you know, and you know that in normal circumstances, you can bring this kind of information back pretty much at will, just when you need it. This is, of course, the setup that we were trying to achieve with Otto and the notebook as well. This sort of interchangeability, think of it financially as a fungibility, if you like, of onboard storage and easy access, is visible, I think, in a lot of our daily encounters. Someone might come up to you and say, "Do you know the time?" You'll say yes, and then you might look at your watch or pull out your phone. You don't say, "No, hang on a minute," and then look at your watch and then tell them. You're in command of the information already, you know you are, so you simply answer, "Yes, I know that." We also outsource, I think, aspects of our reasoning to the environment. Think about scribbling while you think. This is another case that I've looked at in some places. So here's a very famous exchange between Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate physicist, and the historian Charles Wiener. So Wiener once remarked casually that a batch of notes and sketches represented a record of Feynman's day-to-day work. Feynman typically reacted sharply. "I actually did the work on the paper," he said. "Well," Wiener said, the historian said, "the work was done in your head, but the record of it is here." Feynman replied, "No, it's not a record, not really, it's working. You have to work on paper, and this is a paper, okay?" So that exchange is from Gleick's rather lovely biography of Feynman, a book called Genius. So one might ask, why care about these kinds of issues? And the deep moral, I think, is that we should care because we just shouldn't accept a neural or even a biological model of persons and minds. That's to say, we shouldn't accept a model that depicts a person or their mind as simply a function of the neural or biological organisation, with everything else relegated to the status of mere tools or scaffoldings. I think this matters for our vision of ourselves. I think in that way it matters too, not just for philosophy, but also for the arts, the sciences and the humanities. It forces us to confront a question that's growing in importance as portable and pervasive information technologies improve. And the question is, where does a person stop and the rest of her world begin? So one quick anecdotal sort of story before getting into that. There's something called memory glasses that have been pioneered at MIT. Memory glasses were developed for Alzheimer's sufferers and other people with perhaps forms of agnosia, visual form agnosia. And what the glasses do is when they encounter, for example, a familiar face or perhaps an object, they can flash onto the glasses information about your relationship to that person, or, in the case of the visual form agnosic, what the object is. Interestingly, they also pioneered this using information that was flashed so rapidly that the person wearing the glasses didn't have the experience of being prompted. And of course, subjects preferred that very much. But still, these are cases, I think, where, if you like, morally, we might want to start to reflect on Where does the person then end and their props and tools begin? And the last couple of stories I want to tell are supposed to focus that issue. So this is Patrick Jones. Patrick Jones suffers very severe memory impairments. He's very much like the lead character in the film Memento. He had repeated traumatic brain injury. As I recall, I think he fell off his trail bike repeatedly. And in the end, he has the kind of amnesia that means that he really just doesn't remember stuff sort of within even small time frames. Nonetheless, Patrick Jones lives a surprisingly normal life. He's a working Catholic deacon in Colorado Springs, and he manages to live this life not due to any very high-tech interventions. Instead, he relies on a combination of Evernote, a popular software package, a Mac program for visualization called Curio, and an iPhone. Courtesy of all of that stuff, just off-the-shelf packages and devices, Jones is able to create large webs of interlinked notes and pointers that allow him to save, search, retrieve, and diagram his own contacts, thoughts, meetings, decisions, and interactions. So there's a nice article about this called What If HM Had a BlackBerry, published in Psychology Today by Gary Marcus. So amazingly, if you like, it's only in virtue of this whole up-and-running web of structure that Patrick Jones is able to recall who he's spoken with, what was decided on, and so on. And yet he carries through complex long-term projects of pastoral care with skill, optimism, and good humour. Patrick the person, I think this is the main claim that I think really comes out of the extended mind story. Patrick the person, I want to say, is now built of both biological and non-biological parts. And some of those non-biological parts aren't even attached to his biological body, the information that is, stored up in the cloud, if you like. If you were to hack into and destroy Patrick's Evernote records, that would be a crime against the person and not merely a crime against his cyber property. It would be tantamount, as Daniel Dennett once commented, to inflicting unwanted brain damage on somebody while they slept. And there are more and more cases like this now. This is David Dorey. Dorey has amnesia following a brain aneurysm. He can't lay down any new personal memories, although he can very slowly and painstakingly learn new skills. So he uses an iPod Touch all day to keep a grip on what he's doing, when he's doing it, and why. The iPod Touch is pinging all day around him. He says, without it, I wouldn't know where to go or what to do. It would feel like I was floating. It's sobering, I think, to reflect that just 20 years ago, folk like Jones and Dorey were often placed in 24/7 care. So lastly, what about us? I think it's easy enough at this point to reflect that our own pens, papers, notebooks, diaries, smartphones and tablets have evolved to complement our brute biological profiles in just the same way as those webs of technological structure complement the biological profiles of David Dorey and Patrick Jones. If David Dorey and Patrick Jones are living examples of extended minds, then so surely are we. So, conclusions. I think the main conclusion of this whole story is that we can no longer afford, if we ever could afford, to embrace this biological model of minds and persons. Instead, our species' self-image, and with it our laws, our educational practice and our social policy, all have to increasingly recognise the extent to which human minds can and do extend beyond the ancient boundaries of skin and skull. So that's a big story, that's the main conclusion. I think it's worth also mentioning at the end some of the outstanding questions. So here's a little bunch of things that we might go away and think about. What, for example, are the mechanisms of neural plasticity that are making all of this stuff possible? There's something about the structure of human brains that makes us especially good at forming these biotechnological coalitions. What is it? What is it about us humans that makes us so good at extending our own minds? Is that just a neural adaptation of ours? Or is that in itself, perhaps, as Celia Hayes has recently argued, a kind of part of a cultural learning process? What, if anything, limits the range of all of this snowballing self-reinvention? What, if you like, what's going to stop the process of mental extension from just rolling on and on? Is there maybe limits of short-term memory, something like that? Or will we be able to somehow offload and augment our own short-term memories, our own working memories, if you like. Related question there, is the underlying machinery of human emotion and consciousness apt for extension? Or are emotions and experiences somehow more deeply linked to our basic biological or neural natures? I think there's a whole bunch of questions like that we can fruitfully think about, but the main moral, of course, is just that we should be very, very wary of a purely biological, skin and skull bounded picture of minds and persons.